Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
This is the podcast where we search for the theories that are going to change the way we see the world. To that end, today we are exploring telepathic behavior in autistic non-speaking children, as made famous by the podcast The Telepathy Tapes. And what better person to take us through that journey than the scientist upon which that famous podcast was based, Diane Hennacy Powell, who is a Johns Hopkins trained physician, faculty member at Harvard, who ended up having some incredible experiences during her time in Boston, which led to her taking on a great deal of independent research in the face of all sorts of ridicule, where she reached out to numerous families and began to actually take their reports quite seriously. So we are unpacking the nature of the strange communication abilities between these autistic children and their caregivers. You're probably aware, if you've listened to the show before, that we did a somewhat critical assessment of the Telepathy Tapes previously on a solo episode, where we purchased the behind-the-scenes footage of the actual trials, and we found some of the evidence to be lacking. It wasn't particularly compelling to us, and we thought of ways in which you could explain what was happening on the tapes without reverting to anything supernatural or telepathic. However, when Diane came over to our studio and we ended up actually looking at some of her tapes, we had a very different experience with that evidence. And ultimately, Diane takes the position that the tapes that Kai has brought to the table in the telepathy tapes are not really the best examples of what are happening. And so we wanted to give her the opportunity to convince us that there was something really interesting happening. And we did think there was something interesting happening. And to that end, I think that we arrived at something really fascinating about the world of science and the way that we approach it on this show in general, which is there's often a really interesting middle ground between magic and fraud. There could be other possible explanations for what's happening, and in fact, I would go so far as to say we should expect the natural world to provide us with mechanisms for how the seemingly unbelievable things can happen that don't revert to either magic or fraud.
Despite the fact that on the surface, they often are most easily parsed as being either magic or fraud.
Exactly. And something similarly is playing out in the academy with respect to cosmology and astrophysics. There seems to be a lot of mystical magic creeping into the explanations for our outer universe. So we've become dissatisfied with this on the show, and we're bringing together a number of people that are quite skeptical of that standard cosmological narrative with people that are staunch defenders of it. It's all happening this summer in Sesimbra, Portugal, June 12th through the 16th, and you're invited to come and hang out with us. We've rented a beautiful seaside resort for the weekend, and it's going to be an absolutely rich and historic weekend of talks, panel discussions, poster sessions, everything that you would love to see at a scientific conference.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. If, in the meantime, you want to have a different way of supporting us, then consider coming over to patreon.com. We get together with our listeners every single week, and it's just been a really good way to get to know what people are thinking about, the questions that they have around the topics that we encounter on the podcast, and it's sort of a way of making sure that the ideas that we're exploring are landing with the people that we want to bring them to, which is you. So come over to patreon.com. If you don't have any cash to spare, that's totally fine. You can tell a friend about the podcast. You can like, comment, subscribe, leave a rating on any of the podcast stores, or just listen and enjoy. That's really the best thing that you can do for us. It'll help us grow, and that's what matters. And for now, enjoy the conversation with Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell about non-speaking children with potential telepathic abilities. In the conversation, I think we're the very first people to cover the ground of what could possibly be happening from a mechanistic standpoint. And so to Shiloh's point about fraud versus magic, I think that there's a real possibility of true mechanistic science being at work here, where the world is just way stranger than any of us could possibly imagine. So sit back, enjoy the ride.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
one of the reasons why I didn't go into neurosurgery is that you have to do 5 years of general surgery before you can even start doing what's the interesting stuff. So you're spending a lot of time, removing gallbladders and that sort of thing. But on top of that, the psychiatry department at Johns Hopkins had a chairman who was a neurologist first and then became a psychiatrist. And so he taught us a neurologically based psychiatry at a time when most of the other programs were psychoanalytic in nature. And what I found fascinating was to hear from him these quirky neurological syndromes, like, for example, Charles Bonnet syndrome, where you have somebody who's going blind and they start to have visual hallucinations as a result of losing their vision. And those visual hallucinations are so compelling that they actually think that they're real. And so, for example, I had this patient who she was complaining to her landlord because she thought that he had sublet her apartment to all of these other people, because she's literally seeing people in her apartment who aren't supposed to be there. And of course, nobody else is seeing them. And in a lot of psychiatric programs, they wouldn't have had the background in neurology to know that if somebody's losing their eyesight, that they can have visual hallucinations. And so they would just think, oh, this is schizophrenia, and put them on an antipsychotic. And of course, that's not going to help the situation. And so I thought, okay, this is actually as interesting as neurosurgery. And instead of spending all of this time in an OR and doing a lot of stuff that's depressing and not the really interesting stuff, I could be spending my time talking with patients who have an experience of reality that is totally different from my experience of reality. And I saw that neuroimaging was coming on board, things like the CAT scan and whatnot. And I thought, yes, we can get the information that a neurosurgeon gets through, the advancement of neuroimaging, and it's going to be far more interesting because I can really spend more of my time exploring, talking with this individual. What's your world like?
Yeah, I actually had no idea that being a scientist was even a job when I was in college. I figured you either become, what do you do with a science degree? You become a doctor, probably. That's kind of what I figured. And I don't know. I actually didn't. I tried working in a hospital one summer. I ended up in a trauma unit, and it was a very traumatic experience, actually. And only later did I realize that there was this whole other side to the hospital where people were trying to understand what the heck was going on. And I ended up finding that super fascinating too. Was conscious? So it sounds like you were trying to piece together how the brain generates different states of experience and awareness. Kind of, that was the undercurrent of your interest this whole time. Did that evolve into actual research projects for you at some point while you were in medical school, or?
Yeah. So what happened is that while I was a medical student and then continuing on as a resident, I stayed at Johns Hopkins. What I did was I predominantly did research on neurodegenerative disorders. So that's another way of kind of looking at the same question of, what is the underlying condition of the brain? What areas of the brain are affected, and what are the cognitive deficits? And then I also became interested in autism, but back then autism was only 1 in 10,000 children, so it was exceedingly rare. But I also was interested in neurodevelopmental disorders. So, so I was looking at both neurodegeneration, the sort of the loss of abilities, and then also looking at neurodevelopment, the enhancement of abilities as the brain matures, and then looking at neurodevelopmental disorders, and really taking that approach to trying to understand what's this relationship between the structure and functionality of the brain and the experiences that people with those brains have.
Did you encounter people with enhanced abilities at any points in this, or was it mostly detrimental disorders where there's some issue with the structure that leads to a deficit in some behavior? What was it ever? Did you ever come across examples of people gaining, let's say, efficacy, or what's the word?
Ability. I mean, like
yeah.
acquired savant syndrome and things like that, where somebody has some kind of injury and all of a sudden they have abilities that they never had beforehand.
At the time that I was in my training, I didn't really meet any people with acquired savant syndrome or any savants. And I even went over to England for 6 months to study with Sir Michael Rutter, who was knighted for his work on autism. And as I said, autism was so rare back then that I really didn't, I really couldn't make that my academic focus. But what happened is that when autism started to, it started to be, 1 in 100 children, that's when I became interested in it again, because I was like, when I saw, an article that said from the CDC that, it's now 1 in 100 children as opposed to 1 in 10,000, I thought, wow, there's enough autism now that, we need to understand A, what's causing the increase in this, but B, it provided an opportunity to start really investigating these individuals who have savant syndrome within the autism population. And, historically, they've been reported to be about 10% of autistic kids. And so I was like, well, that's, if it's 1 in 100 and it's, 10%, then now we're talking real numbers where I could potentially meet some of these children. And Daryl Treffert's work, where he wrote a book, Islands of Genius, I mean, he talks about how you have this interesting combination of severe deficits in some areas and extraordinary abilities in others. And it's and somehow there's a relationship between the two. It's like if you lose this ability, the brain will use it'll find a workaround, which could be will give you the extraordinary ability, or it'll just like in the case of people who are blind from a very early age, their visual cortex, which is a very interesting section of the brain in terms of how it functions, they'll incorporate that visual cortex to help them navigate, for example, using echolocation. And so it's that there's this
like reappropriating.
Yes,
the brain
it absolutely reappropriates it. Yes.
Interesting.
And so prior to starting work with autistic children, had you kind of already mapped out a sense that there was some strangeness in the human brain that was poorly understood, something to do with the electrical properties of it and how they related to various psychiatric conditions that you were carrying with you when you went into this work? Or were you kind of coming into the study of autistic children from the standpoint of, well, this is an interesting phenomenon that is now becoming more and more widespread in the population. Let's go find out what's happening inside of it.
Well, my initial interest in autism really came from a book that I read back when I was in it was either my senior year in high school or, early on in college. I don't remember, but I remember reading this book, Dibs in Search of Self. And it was about this little boy who would have been diagnosed as autistic if it were today. But it was a book about a child who had been studied by a psychologist back in the 60s. And he was a little boy who had all kinds of behavioral problems. I mean, he kept to himself, and he was very he was just a really challenging child for this family to raise, and so they took him to a child psychologist who did play therapy with him. And that book really touched me because here we had this little boy whose life, if he hadn't met that child psychologist, his life would have been totally wasted. And the work that she did with him over the course of a year helped him to come out of himself. And then it turned out that he was later tested and found to have an IQ of 168.
Whoa.
And then when I read Leo Kanner, who was the child psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins, who first came up with the diagnosis of autism, when I read his initial case studies when I was doing my child psychiatry rotations, I saw that of the 11 children he studied, 9 of them were children who sounded, their description was like this boy, Dibbs, where they were being pathologized for being extremely bright. And I come from a family with a lot of really bright people, and I understand how socially as a child, if you've got a mental age of a teenager, but you're in a 5-year-old's body, I mean, you're really not going to find the other children that interesting to play with. You're going to be bored. You're going to get frustrated. You just think of what that is like. And so my interest in autism really related to the fact that it seemed to me that at least some of these cases were pathologizing genius, and that if we didn't take a look at them more closely and not try to have them fit into this, very, myopic, idea that the educational system has of, that requires you to, go along with, a curriculum that's not, really taking into account who you are and what your cognitive skills are. If we're just going to pathologize it, and then nowadays, I mean, a lot of children are, they're put on medications, to get them to settle down. And I just thought, this is really, it's a waste of human potential. It's inhumane, and it really deserves proper attention. So that was really where I was coming from in my interest in autism.
I wonder if for most of human history, kids weren't raised with lots of different ages around at all times. Like, I feel like this is a very unique and new situation where we put all of one age in a room together from a whole community, and then the next year, you kind of age just with people who are exactly time matched to you. I feel like that's a particularly unique event. It's very strange. I mean, when I'm trying to think about the this autism epidemic. I don't know if that's a fair word for it, but the fact that autism seems to be expanding in prevalence. And when was this 1% was back in the 90s or something? Now it's up to what? It's up to a really high rate at this point.
Well, it was one in 10,000 back in the 80s when I first started studying it. And now it's 1 in 30.
Wow. And were you privy to a lot of discussions as to what was happening? If you had any other disease that was flying out of control like this, I feel like there would be all sorts of interesting theories bubbling around about the cause of it and what had changed in the last 20 years to result in this. I mean, do you think that there's some interesting theories as to the rise of that, or is it just an increased surveying, increased surveillance of the disorder at this point, or how much of that is real? How much is it that there are actually a lot more autistic children, and how much of it is just that we know what to look for all of a sudden?
Oh, it's absolutely real. There's no question that there's been a massive increase. But there's not just a massive increase in autism. There's a massive increase in all of the child psychiatric disorders. I mean, ADD, attention deficit disorder. We're seeing, children with anxiety disorders, and we're bipolar disorder, and we're seeing everything has increased. And one of the problems is with autism is that what happened is that with the DSM-5, they created something called autism spectrum disorder, and they just basically said it became this, this sort of like almost like I call it like a Chinese restaurant menu, where it's like if this and that and this, therefore this is the diagnosis, and instead of really a sophisticated deep dive into what's going on with this particular child. So if you have a child who is exhibiting something quirky about their language development, it could be that they develop language early. I mean, this, yeah, or it could be that the way they use language is odd. So the usage of pronouns being reversed. And in other words, referring themselves as you and referring to others as I, because they always hear you say I, and so they think that's, I refer to you as I, and I refer to myself as you because people call me you, and that was like one of the quirks that was early to be identified within autistic individuals, and so something quirky, or Ramsey is a child that I studied, has something called hyperlexia, where he was able to start reading, believe it or not, at 4 months, and by the time he was 2 years old, he could read the alphabet of 8 different languages, and when he was 5 years old, he could read college level texts. So so that's just it's way out there on the bell curve in terms of language development. Then the second thing is that they engage in a lot of repetitive behaviors. And a lot of these repetitive behaviors are, if you look at what they're doing, it's that they're very anxious. They're very obsessive compulsive. I mean, they'll do the same thing over and over and over again. There's something soothing about doing the same thing over and over again the same exact way. And then the third component is that their social development is abnormal. Well, if you've got a quirky language development and you're somebody who engages in repetitive behaviors, I mean, you're socially you're not going to fit in with others very well, and of course your social development is going to be disrupted. So all you need is that triad, but it's like, wow, there's a lot of variation and expression of what any of that means, and yet it all got lumped together. And so then you have these people saying, gee, we don't know what's causing an increase in autism because you don't have a uniform population. And so you're never, and the whole point of the DSM was to have a uniform population, so that you can be sure that we're all talking about the same thing when we do our study. That if somebody writes a study and they say, I studied 100 autistic kids, you know what that is. And so it's no big surprise that you have brain studies that are all over the map, genetic studies all over the map, and
that's really interesting, because we've talked to, there was an autism researcher from, I think it was Loyola University. And one of the conversations that we had with her was centered around how strange it is that there isn't yet a clear genetic basis for autism spectrum disorders. And as I'm listening to you talk, I'm realizing that it might be because what we've done is we've just lumped a ton of people together that have totally different conditions.
Exactly.
But they present partially in ways that are related to one another. And so if you were to break the bins out, how would you reorganize the conditions that you saw in a way that made more sense?
Well, first of all, I would not lump the regressive form of autism in with the non-regressive form.
Can you clarify what that is?
Yeah. So you have these two populations that both get lumped together. One of them is that there's something different about the child very early on. Okay. Yeah. They maybe they don't develop the social smile. So you're anticipating, at around a month of age, that the child is smiling because they're looking at you and they're feeling loving feelings towards you. It's not because they're about to have a poop or something. But kids, characteristically, in autism, they don't do that. Okay, and so that's one of the earliest indicators that there's something different going on here in their social behavior. You have other children that are developing normally. They're starting to develop speech. They've gone past babbling. They're already putting words together. And they're clearly socially bonded with their family, and then something happens, and they almost overnight. I mean, within a period of 24 to 48 hours, they stop speaking, and they stop. They become more to themselves. And they're just not engaging anymore. And so that's what's meant by regressive autism. And to me, it's such a totally different breed of cat, so to speak, that it should never be lumped in with the other, but it is. And
does it ever turn out that a child that has some kind of triggering experience for autism symptoms that are normally regressive, is there ever a case where they have acquired characteristics that make them go in the savant direction rather than the regressive direction? Or is regressive autism always, or I guess this is a crazy way of asking it because regressive means regression, but you're saying that there's children that develop normally, they hit a point and then something happens and then their abilities seem to regress. Are there ever children that develop normally and then get to a point where something happens and then they appear to gain function, gain abilities, or is it always in that case regressive?
So it's happened with these children who are non-speakers is that they've regressed in terms of their ability to speak. But once they learn the spelling technique, then what happens is that they start to communicate, and then that's when the parents start to say, well, this kid's a genius when it comes to mathematics, or this kid's actually, knows languages that I didn't teach this kid these languages. How does this kid know these languages? And and I have no idea what percentage of these regressed autistic individuals have these savant skills, but I've heard this from parent after parent after parent after parent. And that's really what, I've been wanting to study is, see if I can document those, because it as I said earlier, there's this, we know of conditions in which there's a loss of something early on during development when the brain is extremely plastic, and you can, and there's compensatory mechanisms that come into play. And so that's the way I see it. And so there's this, it's like you have this, it's like, well, instead of doing that, instead of putting the energy into that, or whatever resources that is taking, or you're putting it into something else. So some of these children, they have extraordinary auditory abilities. I mean, a lot of autistic children have perfect pitch, for example.
Are there any, can you cluster these children according to developmental moments in terms of where their brain is at when this regressive moment happens? Are there any stimuli that have been associated with it, or is there any reason to believe that they had some shared trauma or some shared experience that led them to this switch? Is there any sense of that?
Well, what happens is that they get pushed over the edge. Their immune system is overactive because during development, when the brain is being sculpted, because we have more brain cells and more connections between the brain cells than we need. So during the learning process, during this first 4 or 5 years of life, you have these cells in the brain called microglia, which are like the macrophages in the peripheral system, and they're part of the immune system. And what they do is they remove faulty synapses, or they remove ones that are redundant.
Pruning.
And yes, that's what pruning is. And we know that autism is that there's something that those cells get overactivated, and that something goes wrong with the pruning process. And so you have areas of the brain that don't get pruned. And so you have all of this built-in wiring redundancy, and then you have other areas of the brain that get over-pruned. And so you're literally shaping the brain in ways that is very different from the way that ordinary brain development occurs at a time when they're acquiring certain skills, like the ability to express language. And so the area that seems to get taken offline is what they at that time are actually acquiring. So that's your question.
The brain is it's the more you understand about it, the less it seems like a machine or a computer and like something totally different. It's so wild. So is there any sense of what it is about our modern age? Like, I guess my mind goes to two places. One is either this is just some environmental switch that's happened in our modern landscape, and the other is that there's something evolutionary happening as well. And I don't know how you separate out the two. Like, is autism par for the course in terms of a being that's adapting to its new environment, or is it just a pathology that results from something toxic in our environment, whether it's psychosocial or chemical or what else? Do you have a sense of which one of those two paths is playing out?
I don't think it's an either or. I think it's all of the above. So evolutionarily, what you have something called assortative mating. Okay, and so in assortative mating, what you have is individuals who are similar to one another, who are attracted to one another, like the two of you.
Yeah.
And that they're attracted to one another, and they have children together. And so what that does is it makes the next generation, rather than there being, that you're moving towards the mean. Okay, you're deviating away from the mean, because it's like you're getting the child is getting kind of a double dose, so to speak, of that genetic inheritance, whatever it is. And so 9 of the children who were in Leo Kanner's initial study were children whose parents were these highly intelligent academic types. And so what happened is that with the modern society putting women in a position where they're leaving the home, going into the workforce, pursuing what it is that they're interested in, and let's say in the sciences, and then meeting another person who and falling in love and having a child together. I mean, if you go back to the old days, you had more of the, I'm marrying the girl next door, and kind of thing. And it's, because our families all got along and whatnot. And you had more of a mixing of the genetics, as opposed to kind of a more selective breeding. Just like, how do we have all of these different species of dogs, many of whom, it's like, really? These are the same species? This Great Dane and this little
The wolf and the Chihuahua?
Yeah. And it's and yet they could interbreed, because it's not that they're chromosomes are incompatible, and so you have this sort of a mating going on for sure, and that's more of a product of modern culture. And then another thing that you have going on is you have had the introduction into the environment of all of these untested chemicals, electromagnetic frequencies, that we don't know the effect they have on brain development. We don't know the effect that they have on genes. How many, we focus so much on the increase in cancer, which was much rarer when I first started my medical training than it is today. Well, it's because we have a lot of environmental agents that we're exposed to that are carcinogenic. And it's not until somebody does enough research to and finally gets through all of the hurdles you have to go through to finally get them to admit, okay, yeah, maybe we should take this product off of the market because it's now we know it's a carcinogen. Well,
and then of course they can develop like 3 more analogs for it that haven't been tested immediately, right? We were going through like this plastic study the other day, and it was wild just because every single time that the FDA or somebody would catch up with one of these chemicals that was potentially toxic in some way, developmentally, endocrine disruptors and so forth, the industrial sector would pop out 3 analogs, synthetic analogs that probably did the same thing, but they hadn't, had a chance to test them. And so it's always this, whack-a-mole problem with these chemicals. It's not like there's 1 or 2 suspicious environmental pollutants. There's thousands of these things.
That's right. And so, what we're seeing in the umbilical cord of when a baby is born, in the blood in the umbilical cord, we're seeing tens of thousands of chemicals that have never been tested for what effect they have on brain development. And people would argue, well, we can't it's unethical to test them, and it's true. I mean, I'm not going to expose a developing fetus to chemicals purposely to see what does this do to your brain development, but we are inadvertently allowing the testing to occur, and the brain is literally the most sensitive. It's the most exquisite organ, and it is the most sensitive to these kinds of issues, which is one of the reasons why we have the blood-brain barrier. But the blood-brain barrier in a baby is not as thorough at keeping things out of the brain as it is in an adult. And so that's one of the things that's going on. Another thing that I found out is that a lot of people assume that the placenta is filtering out a lot of these toxins, but the reality is that the placenta actually concentrates them in the baby. So the way that it works is that the placenta is taking things from the mother it'll rob the mother's nutrition in order to feed the baby. Okay, the priority shifts towards the baby, and so it's designed to be concentrating whatever's in you in the baby. Well, if you're somebody who's not eating organically, if you're somebody that's and it includes even products you put on your skin that are absorbed through the skin. I mean, you're still getting that in your body, and so that's getting concentrated in the fetus at a time the brain is undergoing development, and
in a crazy mixture too, right? Because most of the time when we actually test these things in the lab, anything that's tested is tested one chemical at a time. And here it's just this unholy stew of whatever's in the environment that's mixing together in some completely unpredictable way that affects both hormones and development and everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, I think that it's really important for women who want to get pregnant to try to remove the toxins that are in their body as much as possible. I mean, to really go through a cleansing process. I mean, there's all this attention put on on the mother once she gets pregnant, saying now don't drink alcohol and don't take any, you can't take any medication and you can't do this and that. But it's like, meanwhile, their body's got all of these other chemicals in there. They're not saying, and you have to eat organically, and you have to stop using any shampoo that's not natural, and you've got they're not doing that. They're not taking it to that next level.
I think that the problem is even crazier, which is that it's almost impossible to find products that aren't contaminated. Like I remember there was a big article that came out about PFAS recently, which is this, I can't remember what they use it for. I think that it's maybe a softening chemical of some kind, but it's basically inside of everything. The cat has
Our cat is
arrived.
bothering Diane. Mingus, come on, behave yourself. Have a seat, buddy.
So 3M invents this chemical in the 50s, and decades later, there is a analytical chemist that comes to work for 3M who is assigned with the task of figuring out, she's not told this explicitly, but her task is to figure out if there is environmental contamination with PFAS and to what degree the contamination is happening. And every single sample that she tests is contaminated. All of the agricultural products, all of the farm ranch products, breast milk, blood from humans. And the company is telling her that there must be something wrong with her machine, that there's some problem with how she's running the experiments. And eventually she's able to find like a sample of either blood or breast milk from rural China in the 1940s. And she tests it and it's not contaminated. And so the landscape is such that even if you're careful, even if you're watching out, like these are just things that are in everything. They're falling out of the sky. They're being consumed by every living creature. And so there is some amount of stuff that you can do, but I wonder if there isn't just some weird wall that we've come up against, which is that there's not an island of safety.
There's no control either for the study, it seems like.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it would be very, very difficult to create the purity within ourselves that we would ideally like. But at the same time, we can increase our chances of it having less of an impact. And so if you look at these children who develop autism, what you find is that there's something faulty in their ability to detox. There's something, and so there's a lot of different reasons why somebody might have difficulty detoxing.
Yeah, can you elaborate a little bit?
Well, so what happens is that all of the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, which gives the energy for processes to occur, all of those mitochondria come from the mother's egg. They don't come from the sperm. Okay, and so maternal mitochondrial health is essential. And so what happens is if there are toxins that have disrupted normal mitochondrial function, then you're going to pass on those faulty mitochondria. And so generation after generation, you have fewer and fewer mitochondria, let's say, that are really efficient at what they're supposed to do. And there are things that you can do to improve your mitochondrial health. And so these are the kinds of things I'm looking into, is, to what degree can we improve mitochondrial health, kind of get them back on board and just support those detox pathways. And I think that can do a lot. And
it's like diet, exercise level things, or what else?
Well, there's just different nutritional supplements that can help. Like L-carnitine and coenzyme Q10. I mean, they're just different, sort of natural supplements that support mitochondria, and 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 the brain is chock full of mitochondria as well. So it's not just about faulty mitochondria playing a role, in the detoxification, but it's also faulty mitochondria playing a role in terms of the brain being able to do what the brain does. And Dr. Zimmerman, who is the head of the Kennedy Krieger Center at Johns Hopkins, which is the center there for studying neurodevelopmental disorders, he identified faulty mitochondria as the reason why some children develop the autism after after they get, it's not, I mean, the vast majority of children don't get autism after they've had it, but if they do, what he found is that they have faulty mitochondria, so that whatever's in that that child is not able to clear it out of their system very well.
This is actually the point that the Loyola researcher, whose name I cannot think of off the top of my head, made.
I can't either, sorry.
But she basically explained that there are some metabolic conditions that predispose kids to being injured by environmental exposures, whatever that is. And so one kid will be totally fine, no problem at all. And then if somebody else is experiencing some kind of redox stress or there's problems already with the mitochondria, then they go down this really unfortunate path for the parents and for the families. And we also talked to Stephanie Seneff, she's been doing a lot of work on the health of mitochondria and glyphosate and all these things. And so I think that there's a pretty cohesive frame by which people are recognizing that environmental contaminants and exposures are definitely contributing to the autism epidemic. That's kind of, I think that that's not at all controversial at this point.
But that it's just unendingly complex and it's not this simple story, I mean, we're not even allowed to talk about this on YouTube, honestly.
Which is why
I'm trying to avoid it. Like, we're gonna have to probably bleep out that word when you said that word earlier, which is pretty hilarious that we can't just have a conversation about it, because, like, the Loyola autism researcher was like, absolutely, there are some children who are susceptible to these medical interventions. That it's not as simple as everybody is susceptible to them, or that the cost outweighs the benefit, or anything like that. But like, can't we at least like look at this issue? And that was a bit tricky to navigate in terms of even getting that release out.
But I want to see if we can pivot, because you said something that was really, I think, apropos here, which is that it's not that it happens to everybody, but that it is a real thing that should be pursued and studied. And I feel like this probably can also be applied, Diane, to your work, which is that we have autistic children that are either developmentally unique from birth, or they have this regressive event. And then in some fraction of those children, you start to see the development of unexplained capacities. And so let's talk about the unexplained capacities and where you think this is coming from.
Well, so I'd say one of the most common things that people contact me about is that they say my child can read my mind. And it's not always the parent. It's sometimes the person who contacts me is a speech therapist who's working with these children, and they say, this child's reading my mind. And they contact me because it goes against their idea of what's possible. The people that have contacted me traditionally over the past 12, 13 years that I've been doing this work are not people who wanted anybody to even know they contacted me. I mean, a lot of them were, they were, medical doctors, people, engineers, psychologists, various professionals that were raised in the materialist model in science, where they were told, things like reading minds is impossible. And then here they're experiencing this with this child, and they're just like, and yet this is what I'm seeing in front of me. And they do an internet search, they find me, and they go, oh wow, somebody with these kind of credentials is actually studying this. And then they want to know, how is this possible? What's going on? What do I do about it? a lot of them are actually terrified because they're like, does this mean that every thought I have, this child is picking up on? And they don't want the child to pick up every thought that they're having. And so those are the kinds of people that have contacted me over the years. I mean, and I've had from all around the world, over 60 people contact me, and now it's like around 100, and so it's a phenomenon that's happening over and over and over again, and I felt that this is really worthy of investigation to see what's going on. And then I'd say more recently, over the last 3-4 years, some of these parents have said that they've also contacted me saying, okay, the mind reading thing was, hard enough for me to swallow, but now, this child is telling me that they're getting messages from this deceased friend or relative of mine, and they're saying, how is this possible? And they're just as blown away by that, because that's yet another, it's another layer. It just adds a whole other layer to things about what's possible.
So these kids are nonverbal, right?
Yes, for the most part. Mm-hmm.
So how are the parents and caregivers and therapists, how are they communicating with the kids in order for them to discover these abilities?
So what's happened is that a lot of these children were, they regressed, they stopped speaking. The parents were told, don't expect much of your child. They'll never, they're just never going to be able to function. And and sometimes they're even told you should institutionalize the child. That's what happened to a lot of these children in the past. But say the majority of the parents, the thought of institutionalizing their child, that they love their child, and so that is just an important idea to them. And so typically what happens is that one or the other parent ends up having to leave their work to devote their time full time to these children, because they are really a full-time job in and of themselves. And because these parents, the ones at least who contact me, are highly educated people, they really value education. And they want their child to get some rudimentary education. And so when they hear about a technique that was developed by a woman named Soma, who is an Indian woman who has an autistic, non-speaking son named Tito, and they hear about her, and she was featured on 60 Minutes back, I don't know, 25 years ago or so, a long time ago. When they hear about her and this technique of teaching the children how to point to letters to communicate, they want to learn that. And so what happens is they take a course, they take a workshop, they learn how to work with this child this way. And in the process of doing that, or they find somebody who does that, and in the process of doing that, they see, oh, this child actually is more on track with their age, or even advanced for their age, than I ever thought. I'm not having to teach this child from the very beginning. I mean, they've already been somehow picking up language. They've been acquiring, and anyone who's had a child knows that little children are like sponges for language. I mean, to me, it's even a miracle how they take sound and ascribe meaning to it. And so what they start to see is, oh, this child is really on track. That's the first thing that they say. And then they might be doing math work with them, and they go, oh my gosh, this child is like more advanced in math than I would have imagined. And that's now we're getting into something different than language acquisition, because we all know of children who they don't have to have a parent spending devoted hours to teach them language. They, just let them loose and they'll eventually learn language pretty much if they're interacting with people. And so, but now it's like this child can do this child can do solve this mathematical equation, or this child can give me a cube root of a number. And because they know about mathematical savant syndrome, which is something that's been in the literature, it's been in the literature for over 200 years, where there have been these individuals that haven't been educated to do math, but they can do math for some reason. So they go, oh, my kid's a mathematical savant. But then something happens that they realize that this child isn't a mathematical savant, or they could be, but they're reading my mind too. And how that happened with Haley, whose father is a psychiatrist and knew of the work of Daryl Trefford and thought his daughter was a mathematical savant. The therapist working with Haley was doing math with her, and her calculator died. And so she switched calculators, and the calculator that she had, which was out of the sight of Haley, the calculator that she had gave the answer for the first time in logarithmic notation. And Haley gave her answer in logarithmic notation. And then the therapist is like, wait a minute, why are you giving the answer in logarithmic notation? How'd you know that that's the way that the answer showed up on the calculator, which, as I said, is out of sight? And then that's when Haley wrote, I can see the numerators and denominators in your mind, And she's like, what? She's like, are you telling me you read my mind? And she's like, yes. And then she started testing it and saying, well, what am I thinking now? And then Haley would type it. And then she's like, oh my gosh, how is this possible?
And Haley was typing on her own at this point?
She was typing independently into one of these iPad like devices with an electronic voice. And if you have a CD player or a connection where you can let me plug a CD player into computer, I brought along a DVD that is the DVD that the family sent to me back in 2012, showing her, and you'll see that it's what she's doing is different from what you're seeing with the letterboards, because and even this DVD is not ideal. Because the therapist is holding it, but she's not moving it. She's just holding it still. And it was from seeing that, I thought, okay, this is really, this is worthy of investigating. So that's so that's the story of Haley, who's the first child that I really studied extensively. And there's a lot of elements of that story that are common to these kids, where it goes kind of in that arc of, they're told the kid can't do anything. Then they learn about using spelling to communicate. Then they discover that their child really kind of knows things, that they're like, how do you know this? And then they discover that they're mind reading. And so it's something's going on there. I mean, and it needs to be investigated. And it's, as I said, there's enough parents that are out there with children like this that I think it really, it's very, very necessary to study it.
Yeah, like what was your technique of investigating these when you would go and meet with somebody like Haley? Like, would you try to control for as many variables as you could? Like, did you try to talk yourself out of what you were seeing as it was happening? Like, did you try to think of ways that it could be explained, that you could remove those variables from the equation somehow?
Well, so what happened is that when I first saw it, as I said, she was able to type into this talker, and that would be sitting on the table. And then the first thing that I did was I randomized stimuli. Okay, and there no change in anything. I mean, didn't matter. I mean, and so then the next thing I did was I said, well, I'd like for you to be in separate rooms, and that's not something that they wanted to even try. And so I was like, okay.
Do you think that's significant?
I'm sorry?
Do you think it's significant that they didn't want to try that?
No, I don't. No, I wouldn't put too much weight on that. I think what's important to understand is that autistic children are very routine oriented, and the if you try to change their routine, it's incredibly disorienting for them, dysregulating for them. They and they just won't cooperate. And I don't think that it's because it's impossible. I just think it's that well, why do we have to do it that way? And so I thought, okay, and there's also they have high anxiety. There's a lot of evidence that's been that shows that they have high sympathetic nervous system discharge and low parasympathetic. So they get triggered very easily. And so with Haley, I was like, well, if I can't put you in separate rooms, then I want to put a visual barrier between you and the therapist. And upon doing that, that's when Haley regressed, and she stopped typing directly into the talker. And so the video that you see of her, she went back to the way that she learned how to spell initially, which was using the stencil board. But I thought, well, at least I have a barrier so that she can't see the therapist. For sure, she couldn't see the stimulus. But now the problem is there's this barrier that she's reaching around like this to hold the stencil board, but she's not, in moving the stencil board up and down for Haley, she's not seeing where the stencil board is on that side. Okay, so she doesn't have any visibility, just like Haley can't see her, she can't see Haley either, and she can't see, where Haley's pointing with her pencil, she's just putting it down. And a lot of people get they get put off by the fact that the board is moving. And the reason why the board is moving is that these children tend to perseverate and get fixated. And so if you don't move the board, the kid will keep hitting the same letter as though you don't get it. And so Haley would, hit the letter, and then she would, type it into the talker, but it's a way of just kind of like with the the movies where they have the they have those devices. I don't know what you call them.
The clappers for the audio.
They're just like cut, or start.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like it's a signal that okay, move on to the next, or now we're starting, and so they need these prompts like that to keep them on task, and that's why Soma named her method of teaching communication rapid prompting method, because you're doing it rapidly, but it requires prompts to keep the kids' attention, because it's a boring task. I mean, to have to be communicating in such a slow way, especially when, for many of these children, their minds work so rapidly that you're asking them to slow down and focus on something that, as I said, it's a relatively boring thing. So, so I tried to do that, and I had cameras all over the room that were mounted, and I had everybody mic'd, so that if there was any kind, so we knew that there would, there was nothing that the therapist was saying to give the child cues. So
did they still have a line of sight with the therapist?
No.
I thought no.
No. They were both facing this wall with a physical barrier between them that the therapist had to reach around. And so what you're seeing with the footage of Haley is two cameras views slapped together, and so it doesn't give you a really, I wish that there was that you saw the camera view that which we have in the data, but where you saw the camera view where you saw the setup, so that you saw that there really was a barrier between them that she was having to work around. And then you can also, there was a camera view from the front that you can also see, what are their eyes doing, what's going on there. But the footage that people have seen is really the footage that I used for a scientific presentation, where people are going to want to see, both sides. They're not going to want to see all the, you only have, half an hour for the presentation. And so you're not seeing all that, but it exists in the archives of it.
I think we might have watched this one. If I remember correctly, the cameras are behind the girl and the therapist. The therapist has a calculator and a notepad. And at one point, I think she has sentences. And then Haley writes for a period of time on a notebook, and then they start to do the spelling. And then after she gets the letter right off of the board, she then enters it into the iPad. Or so
right.
I think that we watched this one. And the only thing that I saw there, that gave me pause, was that is it the speech therapist who's working with her?
I'm sorry, the what?
Is it the speech therapist who's doing the spelling with her? The moment that Haley lands on the right letter, she removes the board. And so there is this moment where Haley's kind of like looking around, and then she lands, and then she removes it. And so I'm like, it's the therapist is selecting the letter through that action, because if she lifted it as soon as she pointed anywhere, it would have been a different letter.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I was saying what I was saying, that to explain why the board's being lifted is because it has to do with the perseveration, but also that the therapist can't really see what Haley's doing. Okay. And so
how does she know the letter then?
Yeah, how does she know to raise it at the right letter?
So it's a stencil, okay? And what Haley's doing, she's taking her pencil and putting the pencil inside the letter, and there's a pressure to it. So she feels the board move when she's hovering. There isn't that kind of feedback from the pressure for the therapist. And Haley did this with two different therapists who both independently, discovered that she, was mind reading. And so I was able to test it with two therapists, but the footage that you saw is only with one of them.
Well, so in the case of something like, this is actually a question I wanted to ask. So if there's two people that can do the spelling with Haley, technically it should be possible to run the experiment where one of the therapists is the one who is the mind reading target.
Absolutely. That was what I wanted to do when I was there. But I was only there for 3 days, and it was so hyper-stimulating for Haley to have, these strangers in her house, cameras, the divider, and but I really wanted to do that experiment, and so my intention was to come back and do that, but unfortunately, I never got funding to do that. And the family, what happened was shortly thereafter, actually, the day that I was there, the weekend that I was there doing those experiments, the family found out that this child that they wanted to adopt from the Philippines, the family's Filipino, that this child that they wanted to adopt from the Philippines had become available. So literally within like 3 or 4 months of that study, before I had money for research, they now have a new kid running around the household. And it was like that became the priority, and the reason why they adopted this younger sibling for Haley was that Haley has an older sister. Her older sister had gone away to college, and they're like, Haley needs to have another child around. And they also wanted to help out children in the Philippines, especially from the same, island that they were from, that rather than this child being in an orphanage, they're like, and they've since then adopted yet another child. And so it was like, so it wasn't like, it just made things difficult. And it was like a lost opportunity. I mean, and it's unfortunate because, all of that was 12, 13 years ago. Since then, those therapists have moved on. And the parents tell me, I'm still in contact with them, they tell me that Haley still is mind reading. The mother says she can experience the mother reading her mind, but nobody's there practicing it with her. Before, when as part of their services, they had these paid for therapists coming into the home, spending, each of them spending, I don't know, maybe, 15, 20 hours per week with the kid. It was a setting in which, it was easy to get them to incorporate, well, can you practice some telepathy under this new circumstance? Just add that on to what you're doing with the homework. Because I didn't want it to, she still needs to be doing homework and getting an education and whatnot. And so, but then, when the therapists, moved on, and it was like, well, okay, there's a lost opportunity. And so, but I'm still very interested in that. And so, right now what I'm doing is I'm taking all of these different people that have contacted me about a child that they say is mind reading and saying, well, is there anyone else that can be the facilitator for the communication with them? Because I'm specifically trying to find cases where we can set up the ideal protocol. And so that's now I'm in a position where I have people that want to fund my research, and so I'm in a position where I can start doing those things. It's just that I'm a little bit starting from scratch because it's not the situation I had, which was much more ideal 12, 13 years ago.
Hey folks, pardon the interruption. Remember, we work directly for you. That means that you have to actually come over and see how you can support this project directly. That allows us to not put ads on this show, not sell you junk, and not have any sponsors. But you've got to do your part. So come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and see how you can give the tiniest amount in order to support this project going forward. Thank you.
Okay, so basically Diane has brought with her a recording of a couple of communication sessions with a girl named Haley from, it looks like we're looking at the DVD right now, it's from 2012. And so this is from kind of a while ago. And we're going to watch it and we're going to see what we think.
So in this one, the therapist is holding the device. You'll see, though, she's steady in her holding of it and not moving it. But I've also seen Haley do it with the device down on the floor.
So Haley is sitting down at the table. On the table is the tablet that they're going to be spelling on. Haley's kind of vocalizing. I think she needs to be coaxed into sitting down a little bit.
Yeah, she's
been convinced. They're sitting down. You can see the tablet. It's kind of like a simple just row of letters with spaces between them. Somebody picks up a card that has a yellow sun on it, shows it to the speech therapist kind of behind Haley's back. And now Haley is starting to spell, and the therapist is not moving the tablet at all. And you can see that she's spelling YELLOW. And she's kind of still moving around. Can't see what she's doing quite yet.
So you can see that she hovers around a bit, but the therapist is not moving the device.
Yeah, and she clicks to where, after she's finished spelling, she clicks to where the letter showed up to kind of signify that she's done. That's wild.
Why does the therapist need to hold the device at all? It seems like it's standing up on the table.
Now we're going to do it with a star that says Barbie on it.
Oh, she holds it.
The therapist doesn't have to hold it. I did experiments where it was just on the table, okay? But this is what I had as a DVD that I could bring to you and show you. But part of what it does is her holding it kind of gets Haley to, it's sort of like, come on, Haley. It's a way of, like when you're working with little kids, you can get them to cooperate if if you're there with them and you're kind of, it's a lot of it is to keep, see, it says Star Barbie.
Star Barbie. Wow, that's incredible. Wow.
So it's just showing that, that's what it was. Okay.
And so are you the one who's running this test, or is this the family?
I believe that's the mother who's, it's either the mother or
white. So now it's another card that's kind of like this weird white splatter, and it says white underneath it.
You can see the therapist isn't touching Haley at all. Her hands are totally on the device.
Yeah, this is a much more controlled system than what I saw in the Telepathy Tapes
And
videos.
it says white.
It says white. Yeah.
Which makes sense because the splatter is hard to...
Now, has Haley seen these cards before?
She's seen those cards before, but she's not seeing them in this. I also tested her with cards that she hadn't seen before.
I mean, I think that the proof of principle is here, right? It's just there's, even if she's seen the cards before,
Yeah.
the
She's got her back to this, and now she's the therapist is holding the tablet still. She's not lifting it up at the end of each letter like in the Telepathy Tapes demos.
There's one part of this that I wonder about, which is like when you have people that are really super keyed into each other and able to pick up cues of, like breathing and micromotor movements and these sorts of very, very subtle cues. Do you have any sense that there's the possibility that at least a part of the communication might be coming from these kinds of just, like the speech therapist exhaling slightly when she's above the right letter?
It's hard to, because it's hard to, I mean, is that possible? Is it possible? Well, I mean, anything's possible in that sense, but is it likely? I don't think so. I mean, because as I said, this is just what was sent to me that made me say, okay, I want to go visit this child and do my own experiments. Okay. And I gave stimuli that were not stimuli that this child had any prior knowledge to, that the therapist had any kind of exposure to as well. And so then you'd have to say, well, there's a different little breath movement for each letter or whatever. But I mean, that really to me is like stretching. There is something going on. Somehow she's getting that information.
Definitely.
There's, and what it is, whether or not it could happen from separate rooms, I don't know. I haven't had the opportunity to test it, but I think you'll agree that is more compelling. I mean, some of the arguments about the stencil board that can disappear.
Did you make that video, by the way?
No, I didn't make that. No, the family made that to send to me for me to understand what it was that they were telling me about. They said, they contacted me. They said, she's able to read the minds of these two therapists. I said, can you? And this is before Zoom conferencing was being done, and they said we'll capture a video and put it on a DVD and send it to you. And so that's how this happened.
Are there cases where you went to go see a family and you discovered that it wasn't telepathy, or that it was kind of something that was coordinated between the parents and the children, or at the very least that you had the sense that something wasn't quite right? Or has this been a case of just 100% hit rate?
Well, so first of all, I've been self-funding. And so, and it's very expensive to go fly somewhere, stay at a hotel, miss work, all of those things. So I'm been very, very selective in terms of who I was willing to go out and do these experiments with. And so, I mean, I've only personally studied maybe 5% of the people at most who've contacted me. And when I met Kai Dickens, she didn't want to go back and study Haley. I mean, now she wants to, but she didn't want to. And now it may, as I said earlier, it may be a lost opportunity from the standpoint, that these therapists aren't working with her anymore. I mean, she's much older. So she wanted to see people that I'd never met before, and she wanted to see people that had so recently contacted me that I hadn't even had much in the way of contact with them other than a few email exchanges. And so that's who I introduced her to, and that's who she has footage of. And the people that are the most recent contactees are the ones who more recently discovered it, and so then their communication technique tends to be more primitive because it isn't that they've been doing this for years and now they've advanced from doing it with the stencil board to doing it with a keyboard. And so that's part of the problem with the footage that she has, is that it was just so early on. And I've been told that Mia, who's one of the girls who's in that footage, where there was the touching, I've been told that she can independently type now. I haven't validated that for myself. I can't say or not. I mean, it would need to be investigated. But part of the problem is also, though, that it's one thing when I can have a parent show me something on a Zoom call, but then if you show up with a camera crew and all these individuals, it may be so hyperstimulating for the kid that you're not going to get it.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder, though, if there isn't some capacity for the opposite of Munchausen's by proxy, right? Like, Munchausen's by proxy is when parents do this horrific thing where they make their children sick to get attention. This would be the absolute opposite of finding some kind of gain of function, some kind of ability in their children in order to get attention or to somehow soothe the pain of having a nonverbal child. Like, that percentage could be vanishingly small. Like, it could be less than 1% of parents who would do something like that. I think that's probably the background. But there has to be at least some percentage of parents that would do that, because we know that they do it in the opposite direction, and that seems far more horrific than convincing yourself that your child is special in a positive way. And so if it happens in the negative, it seems fully plausible that it could happen in the positive.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm very familiar with Munchausen's. I mean, I actually saw a case of it when I was in my training. I mean, and it is just, it's hard to even fathom, somebody that would actually purposely make their child sick so that then they get all of this attention of, oh, you poor mother, and this must be really hard, and you're so devoted, and so those people are, the parent is seeking that kind of attention. That's a Munchausen's by proxy, and as opposed to people that make themselves sick to get medical attention, and I've seen that as well. But what you have to understand is that people like this who, like Haley's parents and other people who contacted me over the years, they didn't want anyone to know. Okay? They were like, please assure me of my anonymity. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I said, I don't know that, I have the parents' permission to have you see this. they are so afraid of the stigma, the scrutiny, that they don't want their child to be regarded as a freak. They don't want people to think that they're crazy. And in fact, I mean, I was talking with this retired doctor who has adopted a boy who's a non-speaking autistic, who can actually write the answers. So doesn't even use a communication device. And he told one of his neighbors about the boy's ability to read his mind, and he said the neighbor stopped speaking to him.
Whoa.
And so
That's wild.
so if anything, there's more of a hesitancy to draw attention to this. They're reaching out to me wanting understanding. Now, what's happened though with Kai and the telepathy tapes is that she's attracted a different. She's just attracted a different subpopulation than the one that I've been working with. She's attracted people that are interested in being in documentary, that have, reasons why they want that to be. And you could speculate, as to why they want to be in the documentary, but they want to draw attention to their child, and and they're quite happy to take attention on themselves. And there's this one parent-child combination. They're not in the documentary, but where it was clear that the mother's wanting to draw attention to herself and look at how special my child is. And so, I would call that something more like narcissism by proxy. Where it's and there is something called narcissism by proxy, where it's that you get an ego boost by having this special relationship with somebody who's maybe your spouse, or your child, and you get.
That's how I feel about Anastasia.
Yeah,
I like taking her out in public and taking responsibility for her brains.
Yeah. So you're guilty of it, and that's why she's aware of this phenomena. So
it fits nicely with your Machiavellian tendencies.
So anyway, there is a thing like that, and but that's certainly not the case here. It's not the case for the vast majority of the people who contact me. They just know it's important for science. That they want to understand their kid. A lot of them, they're worried about, how's my kid going to get an education? Are they going to are they going to cheat? And just try to get the answers from people's minds and never really learn it themselves. That's a concern. Or they're concerned of this kid reading every thought, and do I have to find a way to purify my thoughts so that or do I have and they feel like they can't even hide because they do report these spontaneous cases where the kid knows something about them and they weren't even together, and ask them about something, or they were trying to hide something from the kid, I just found out my sister has cancer, and they're like, and the kid's spelling something about, you're worried about your sister because you think she might have cancer, and they're like, I guess I can't hide anything from you. So that's the circumstances under which most of these families approach me. And the studies that I'm going to be doing moving forward are ones in which I'm really going to be looking at the QEEGs, the brainwave activity of the people, the children, and then whoever they're telepathic with, to see, is there is there a synchronization of their brainwaves? Is there something that is a universal pattern that they engage in that's different when they're doing this mind reading thing from when they're doing something else? And if you have enough subjects for that study, then there might be some interesting data that comes out of that. And so I have many people. Maybe 50 people that are interested in that have no desire to be part of the documentary, and they don't even want they're going to be de-identified. Their names aren't going to be out there. They're just willing to contribute the data, and then they want to know what my analysis is, and then if there's something that could be meaningful that can then help them with their child. And a lot of them, what they really want is they want to know, how do we decouple they're really actually not wanting the telepathy to be something that continues.
How do I cure them of this?
They want to, yeah, they want it to stop. They want the child to become less dependent upon them. They want the child to be able. They don't want to be holding the stencil board for the child forever to be communicating. They want that if there's a way for the child to be able to speak or to be able to do this in whatever it is independently. That's what they really want for their child, and they want to also know, what are their gifts besides this that they could be doing something with, and so these parents care about their children, and they're really they've got the right intentions. But sure, there are going to be people that go, look at me, but that certainly isn't the case here.
I wonder if it doesn't become much more difficult in the age of social media, where parents that have children that are nonverbal autistic are part of the same social groups, and they're spending a lot of time engaging with each other online, sharing stories, where there's this kind of transference of community knowledge from one family to another. Like, something that was really interesting in the telepathy tapes was this idea of the hill, right? So all of these kids start to tell stories of a place where they get together. And it struck me that if the parents or the caregivers were all part of some kind of community where one parent mentioned this, then that's the vector by which all of a sudden it gets into everywhere else, into all of these other children, because it really, I think for me, proof isn't the right word. I think for me, a piece of evidence that would be really, really compelling is if there was a child that had a telepathic connection with someone, but was able to spell with multiple people, and so was regularly spelling things out to people that they didn't have a telepathic connection with, things that only the person that they were connected to knows. Does that make sense? Like, they have two people that they can spell with, and a telepathic connection only with one of those people. And so they're always telling the second facilitator things that only the first facilitator knows. Like, for me, that would be like gold standard. Okay, this is something that only one person knows, and they're not involved in the communication whatsoever, and the child is just telling all their secrets to this other communicator. Like, that would be, have you seen anything like that?
I haven't seen that. It doesn't mean that it's not possible to do that experiment. I mean, and that's part of what I'm doing in terms of screening individuals who are willing to be part of my research, is I'm wanting to know, do they have more than one person they're telepathic with? And do they have more than one person that they can have as a facilitator for communication? I mean, ideally, they would not need a facilitator that's helping them, but if they do, do they have more than one? And then I haven't asked, do you have someone who facilitates with you that doesn't, where it seems like the child is not reading that person's mind? I haven't run into that specific situation. It may be that anybody who becomes a facilitator, that the child is able to read them. I don't know. But anyway, I'm trying to find these cases, and yeah, it'd be interesting to see if that happens. Can I say something about your comment about the hill?
Yeah.
Is that I had never heard anybody talk about the hill before I went to Atlanta, and I met John Paul and Houston, who were friends, and their parents are friends. And that's the first time I heard of it. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. But I thought of it as something that was a quirky thing between the two of them, and so I didn't really make much of it. And then Kai talking to someone, but she didn't involve me in that conversation, talking to someone else, heard that person mention the hill. But unfortunately, I was not part of that conversation. And so finding out about this other person talking about the hill happened for me at a time when the cat was already out of the bag. I mean, she had already started talking about the hill with other people. And I feel like it's unfortunate because it's a scientific opportunity that's lost. And so I don't know what to make of the hill. And all bets are off now because of the telepathy tapes. And I have tried just briefly. I mean, we tried doing a telepathy experiment between John Paul and Houston, and they weren't able to do it under the way that we set it up. So,
Houston is also a nonverbal autistic?
yeah, Houston and John Paul are the two non-speakers who first brought up the concept of the hill when we were in Atlanta. And so when I first heard of that, I thought, oh, well, you both can, if you're both communicating via the hill, can you just communicate with one another telepathically here in front of me?
What kind of test did you do for that?
I'd really had it set up in a way that was similar to how I set it up when I'm testing it with a caregiver or therapist, where I'm showing, I'm saying, okay, Houston or John Paul, look at this word or look at this picture and send this to your friend, mentally send this to your friend, just like you talk with them on the hill, send this to their friend. And then the other kid is like, okay, what is he sending you? And that didn't work. And so it's not the same thing as talking on the hill. But what it showed me is that it's an overstatement to just make it out like, oh, these kids are just telepathic with one another all the time, et cetera. And I hear stories like that. I hear people say, oh, these kids, I see them together and they don't have to talk. Well, they can't talk, but I don't I don't hear them talk, but they seem to be communicating with one another. But I mean, we all can engage in non-spoken communication. It's not that's not that remarkable. So I unfortunately I'll never be able to answer that question.
Is there one experience in all of your time that really just made the hairs on your neck stand up and was absolutely mind-bending? Like, is there any standout experience that you had in any of these tests? I mean, the one that you showed us on the DVD was pretty incredible. Is there anything else like that really stands out in your memory?
Well, I mean, the most mind-blowing experience I had was with the patient at Harvard, where I was the psychiatrist on the consultation liaison service that goes to the medical floors, and I was asked to see this patient who wanted to sign out against medical advice. And the staff thought she was mentally ill and asked me to come and do a consultation with her. And when I went in to see her, she said, well, I don't need to stay. My medical tests are going to come back negative. And so I'm psychic. I can predict the future. And also there's all these ghosts here and it's spooky and I want to leave. And most psychiatrists would have just signed the paperwork that she couldn't leave, that she wasn't mentally fit to make that decision for herself. But I wanted to gain her cooperation. And this is back in 1989, so quite a while ago. And I wanted to gain.
You were a resident at that time?
No, I was on faculty.
Okay.
And I wanted to just talk her into staying. And literally within 5 minutes of sitting down with her, she said, I really like you. You really got this good energy. And she said, and I'm getting a reading about you. You don't mind if I tell you what I'm getting? I'm like, oh sure, And so then she says, well, your husband's a chemist. And my husband was he was an MD, PhD biochemist. I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's my husband's chemist. She said, and he's applying for a job in 2 different cities right now. And that very week, he was interviewing with people at UC San Diego for a postdoc, and he was also interviewing for a postdoc back at Johns Hopkins where we met. I'm like, well, this is really interesting. And I said, well, she said, in his heart of hearts, he really wants to go one place, but you end up in the other. And I knew in his heart of hearts he wanted to go back to Johns Hopkins. That's where we met. That's where his family lives in Baltimore. I mean, very much an East Coast person. And so I was like, oh, we're going to end up in the other one. And I said, well, and then I said, well, what, where's that? And she said, well, name cities and I'll tell you which one. So I just named off a bunch of cities. San Diego, you'll end up in San Diego. And oh, you'll have a daughter when you're there, and you'll be very successful. And I mean, and so that your husband's a chemist, he's applying for jobs in 2 cities, and you'll end up in San Diego. Okay, well that knocked my socks off, and I was able to talk her into staying, and her medical test came back normal. And then as time went on, and I saw that, we went to San Diego. I had a daughter. I was just like, wow, okay. So how did she know these things? And so that set the stage for my interest in this. But obviously, after moving to San Diego and having seen things unfold, I didn't have any way of contacting this person that I had met at Harvard. And I thought, well, will I ever run into another individual who's capable of doing this? And I always had a bit of a, just to me, to go see, like one of these professional psychics or, palm readers, whatever. I always thought, these people, I mean, they're probably really good at reading situations. People probably give them too much information up front, and and so I always thought that these people probably are not as profoundly gifted as this woman I met at Harvard, who was not somebody who was a professional psychic. She just said I was born with a caul over my face, which is like the afterbirth, which causes some oxygen deprivation, and it's something that apparently, there are traditions that say if that's like a sign of someone who's going to be psychic. So she was half Native American, half African American, and she said, so she's had this gift since she can remember. But she worked as a janitor somewhere, and she she just said it's something that I do for friends, and she said, but I like you, so I'm willing to give you a reading. So,
did she tell you anything that wasn't true?
No.
Wow. Because that's one of the things I've seen, when people try to pick apart psychics, is they'll say that people ignore the negative data that comes in and they'll lean into the...
No, she didn't tell me anything that wasn't true.
Amazing.
Mean, it was so mind-blowing, and it was my first experience, and I liken it to like the first kiss, It's like, and so people, when they say, like, well, weren't you blown away, by working with these autistic kids? You have to understand that, decades before, I'd already had my paradigm shattered just by meeting this person. And I was already aware of Savant syndrome at that time. And even though I hadn't met a Savant, I was like, well, we don't have a model within neuroscience that really precludes this, because neuroscience hasn't even explained, how consciousness is created by the brain, or how a lot of things, how about consciousness in the brain. So I said, so the neurosciences model doesn't really preclude it. And then I was like, and modern physics doesn't preclude it either. I mean, what modern physics tells us is that reality is not the way we perceive it, that our sense of time is an illusion. I mean, that's based on Einstein, his work, is that, time is not just an arrow that moves, in a linear fashion, in only one direction. And so, and I knew that there were physicists like John Wheeler, who said that consciousness has this interaction with realities such that we actually co-create reality. And I knew about the double slit experiment and how the act of measurement itself collapses a light as a waveform into light as a particle.
Well, it changes the future, right? You've gotten yourself involved in the system, and now the system is different. And I think that kind of it ties back to these things as well.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if we could play with the mechanics of what could possibly speculate as to what could possibly be happening here. It seems that humans are electromagnetic entities at various levels, and this is a wild new field, biophotons, and just the role of different organisms, not just humans, but other organisms in electrical communication. We've had a number of people on the show talking about this lately, pretty hardcore scientists in different disciplines that are working on quantum biology. And so it doesn't seem like it. One thing that I like to say when it comes to talking about these things is it doesn't have to be fake or magic necessarily. Like, those aren't the only two possibilities, right? I can pick up a little black square and talk to somebody on the other side of the ocean if I want to right now. Like, I have a friend in Austria, I could just call him up, right? And if you were from 1600, that would essentially look like I was a witch or something, right? Because you don't understand electromagnetism and you don't understand how these transponders work and how it's encoded and all of this stuff. So it seems to me like, if this does prove out to be a phenomenon that's reproducible and we can eliminate all possibilities of people misleading the experimenters, then we have to start searching for the mechanics of how this is actually happening. And it doesn't seem outside, like, I don't think you need to even go into John Wheeler level physics to come up with a mechanism for how this might be happening.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, that's really what you're bringing up is really more along the lines of how I'm thinking about it. Okay. So, a lot of people evoke. So what I'm telling you is the way I was thinking 30 years ago. Okay. Since then, I've discovered all of this research on biophotons and the fact that we emit biophotons. Okay, at a threshold that's below most people's visual acuity, but that we do emit biophotons. And I've also learned that when people read silently to themselves, they still have some subauditory emissions from their vocal cords.
Oh, wow.
And so I think that the information is encoded. If you think about, how is information encoded in our technology? It's encoded in basically modulation of waves. Okay, and so modulation of sound waves. Okay, either modulation of the amplitude or the frequency. And that visual information is encoded in, this sort of, you have these, pixels and, patterns of light distribution that create an image. And so it made me think that, that we may be creating, these subauditory vibrations. When we think, we may be emitting photons that have a pattern associated with them that also has information. And one of the things we know about autistic individuals is that their sensory systems are hyperacute. They're very sensitive to light. They're very sensitive to sound. Many of them have perfect pitch. Many of them have extraordinary hearing. And so the way I see it is that they could be like other animal species that we know see and hear outside of the usual range of visibility and and hearing of most of us, and that and it's getting labeled mind reading, but it actually is just that, and that takes it out of the woo, and it's still extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
But it takes it out of the woo, and so one of the things I want to do is see whether or not putting noise cancellation earphones on the kid, blocks out because if I can't get them in separate rooms, there are other ways in which you can minimize these sorts of things. And so if it turns out that the noise cancellation headphones make it so that they can't read the thoughts, but then they can when they take them off, then it's like, it's not a conscious thing. See, when the person is reading silently, they're not they're not conscious. Most people aren't aware of the fact that there's actually some vocal cord activity that's going on, and so it's what makes a lot of sense to me. Because then it's how these people that I really think are quite genuine and sincere in their conclusion that the child is reading their mind, and they're really not trying to scam anybody. That's really what's going on, or if the child, if it's a visual image, and the child is seeing the answer, maybe they're just, they're very good pattern thinkers, and maybe they're just able to connect the dots, that are the biophotons that are being emitted by somebody, because most of them report seeing auras, and what is an aura? It's light around somebody. And Haley, when she was asked by the therapist, how did you know the answer there? She said, well, I see the numerators and denominators in your mind. Well, what's she need by mind? Maybe the mind to her is this, that this light emission that she associates with.
And those have been reported since ancient times too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you see them, and you see them in paintings around people that are, like Jesus, or other religious paintings, and so so that's more where I'm going with this, rather than really putting down the individuals that are involved. I mean, I really think there is something going on, and it's just that for those of us who don't have these abilities, it's as remarkable as, I mean, if I hadn't studied zoology, I mean, a lot of people know this now, but I was aware of, the NCC ultraviolet light. I don't see ultraviolet light. But I know that what we see is such a narrow range of all of the frequencies that we're swimming in. And what we hear is just a narrow range of all of the, the vibratory, sound that we're exposed to.
Yeah, I think it's really important that people start thinking about these extraordinary pieces of evidence in a way that doesn't just come down to magic versus fraud. Like there has to be more nuance to the consideration than that, because I think that we hardly understand how the biological world works. I mean, how many animals are even studied? There's like 3 model organisms or something, there's more than that, but it's a very small part of the planet that we even really understand, let alone have genomes for, let alone understand protein interactions and everything downstream of that.
I mean, and this brings us back kind of to where we started, right? Which is that the history of science is a history of overturning dogmas that held for thousands of years. Like I'm reading, I don't know if you've read The Body Electric.
Oh, yeah.
Came out like in 87, I think, and I just started it, so I'm not very deep in. But it's fascinating because he's telling the story of how in the 16 and 1700s, people started to discover that there were animals capable of regeneration. And this was dogma that for thousands of years people were like, no, the only things capable of regeneration are plants. And then somebody shows up and they're like, well, no, I can cut this hydra in half as many times as I want and I still get more hydras. And that is, I think, a transformation that at the time didn't really catch, because they were kind of like, okay, well, A, we don't believe you. B, okay, so it regenerates. Like, what do we do? And so ideas have their moment. And regeneration was discovered far before its moment was able to be applied to whatever massive technological machine that we're a part of. But I do think that there are things that are yet to be discovered, and it's never sat very well with me, the assertion that we're not evolving. Because our environment is changing dramatically. And like we talked about, the chemicals we're exposed to, the electromagnetic radiation that we're exposed to, all of these things would seem to
We didn't even talk about viruses.
Yeah,
there's a whole world there.
Yeah, like everything is driving us towards something. And I love that you said that, when you first started looking into this, you had this kind of like quantum intuition that there is something inexplicable in the nature of consciousness and how it affects the experience of the world and how it makes the world. And then gradually you came around to this more just material sense of, well, there's electromagnetic radiation. It's doing things. Like you can stick a magnet on somebody's head and change their mood. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a proven approach. And so there must be some kind of interaction between electromagnetic radiation and the brain. It's written large in that. And now techniques that image brains and are able to pull thoughts from them are starting to come online as well, where you put somebody into like a massive scanner and you can reconstruct the pictures that they're looking at. Where I'm like, that to me says that there's something in there that is being able to be sensed from the outside, and connecting the dots to the fact that these children have this over-amped sensory system. I don't know, it blows my mind. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. Well, there's experiment that is done where they have one person who has electrodes reading, reading information. It's electromagnetic, and then they use the internet to send it to somebody elsewhere, where they use stimulation, and that person can pick up the thoughts. So it's creating a hardwired, if you will, basically model for what might be happening with, what we're calling telepathy.
Cool.
So and I became aware of that research quite a while back. Because the military was interested in, how can we create these helmets where we can have people be in telepathic communication with one another so that nobody can intercept the signal happening. And so, it's like, okay, if the way that, we already know that EEGs, that they are correlated with states of consciousness. You have different brain waves when somebody's in dreaming sleep from when they're awake, and et cetera, and in different stages of sleep and whatnot. And so we already knew that about EEGs, and then this takes it a step further, saying that there's actually a way in which there's more information within that EEG than you would imagine. Okay, it's not just that this particular waveform correlates with that state of consciousness. There's actually some information in there. There's a device now where people can think and surf the internet with a computer.
Mm-hmm. Oh, what is it called? Like, there's a name for this kind of technology.
You're talking about Neuralink?
No, it's not Neuralink. There's
the wristband thing?
No, it's literally like a headset.
Right.
I'm like totally screwing.
It's a headset that you can have the thought that where you do the Google search, and instead of typing the Google search into the search bar, yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, and so I think 60 Minutes did a thing on it, and once again, that is like proof that the electromagnetic signal is rich with all kinds of information. It's just that that was unfathomable to think that was the case before, and yet it makes sense. I mean, I think that what I do know about the brain is that it's highly organized. Information is highly, highly, highly organized within it, and you've got all these modular components to it, but it's far more. There's far more specificity than I ever would have imagined. And what it makes me wonder is, does this person, I suspect that the person with that technology has to train it to its own specific thought patterns. I suspect that it's not a universal thing, because none of us have, our wires have individual variation in terms of how they're wired. So, but I make it analogous to voice dictation. When you first use voice dictation, I remember being one of the initial adopters of that. And my brother, who is a theoretical physicist and AI expert, he helped to develop voice recognition. And I remember the old software, when I first started using it, it was very clunky. You had to spend a lot of time, read this story.
Oh, to train it on your voice.
You had to train it on your specific voice. Okay, and then even then it still had a high error rate. And now I can just open up a brand new laptop. I don't have to train it at all. I just start speaking, and the accuracy is phenomenal. And so I see it as something in terms of a technological advancement that is kind of analogous to that.
Yeah, and it seems like the more that people are aware of those technologies, the less of a stigma there will be associated with this kind of science in general. What did you find, Nastya?
They're called brain-computer interfaces, and there's varying degrees of implant or invasiveness. The exposure that I had to it was that there was a girl I saw on Twitter who was playing video games without using her hands whatsoever. She beat some video game level, and she'd been working on figuring out how to do this for a long time. So it's definitely happening. And we've had a bunch of conversations on the show about the emergence of humans in the first place, which is, in anthropological circles, is a big question, because it's like, okay, well, humans are genetically evolved around 300,000 years ago. They kind of faff around for 250,000 years, and then 50,000 years ago, ceremonial burials, abstract art, symbolism, the first semblances of religion appear kind of all at once, and then in the next 15,000 years just take over where they're everywhere. And it's attributed to this moment of self-conscious awakening, where the humans were able to first come around to the idea that there was an I, and that the I was the actor, and was able to plan for the future, and to think about the past, and then to maybe even to lie, and to control emotions, and to no longer be subject to all of these things. And that's not evidenced in the genome. It doesn't appear to be that you can find a mutation that appears to have granted us that ability. It's just something that was learned. But if you go back to that moment, there were hominid species that didn't have the concept of I, and there were hominid species that did have the concept of I. Or even humans, cultural groups of humans, not species. And so why is something like the ability to sense electromagnetic radiation that is emanating from other people's brains any different as an evolutionary step? It seems like a natural transition. It doesn't seem crazy. It just seems like it's difficult to imagine. But think about how difficult it would have been to imagine the concept of I prior to being immersed in it. If you were born without a sense of I, could somebody explain it to you? Could somebody teach you it? I don't know. Like, some people say that it's like they took mushrooms and they discovered it. Other people say that they were, bitten by snakes and went into trance-like states and discovered it. But I'm like, we have the history of this transition occurring at least once in the human species.
Well, there's a lot of, I remember when I was reading Stephen Gould and, and he was talking about evolution and how it's not this linear, continuous process, that it oftentimes you have these huge leaps, and we don't understand those huge leaps when it comes to a lot of things. What is that? And so many of these things that evolve, it's like, well, you would need this and this and this and so many things to change at once, because it's not going to be adaptive if you only change one thing, because all of these things kind of interrelate with one another and they have to work together as a system. And so, all of a sudden you have not a change in just one thing, but multiple things. And so one of the things that there's a professor at UCLA who has asked me to. His name's John Torday, and he studies evolution, and he's had me review some of his papers, and what he talks about is how there are genes that code for multiple different organs. So if you get a variation in that one gene, it's not just affecting, let's say, the lungs. Okay, it's also affecting the kidneys and affecting, something else, such that you can have a fish evolve into a land mammal, because that, I mean, think of what a transition that is, to go from being in the water to needing lungs. Okay, and I mean, it's huge, and so I think that's the way to think about it, is really more that humans only have something like 22,000 genes, but it's not that it's a one-on-one kind of thing. A lot of those genes have multiple purposes, and then you have this whole you have the other 90% of the chromosomes, that is what we used to think of as junk DNA, that we now know is really plays a role in the expression of DNA.
Feedback loops and everything.
Oh, absolutely. And so it to me is the DNA is like the instrument. It's like the piano with its 88 keys, and then all of the non-coding for protein genetics is really that plays a role, and then it's like the scrolls for the player piano. Okay, that really dictate which keys get played when in combination with other keys, and then you start getting a far more. You can have a synchronized expression, but it's really that complex.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I think right at 3, we said we'd get you out of here by 3. So,
Okay,
Diane,
yeah.
it's been awesome to sit down with you. And thank you for coming. It's really cool that you live out here too. So as your work progresses, maybe we can meet up down the line a little ways and see what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really appreciate you coming out here and
Yeah.
being our first live podcast guest in the studio here too.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And
Appreciate it.
yeah, we'll say goodbye. Say goodbye to everybody, and
Let's do it again sometime.
I'm definitely I've been moved along in my understanding of this. I feel much more curious than after even listening to telepathy tapes or watching those videos. This has been fascinating.
I would say an order of magnitude more curious than after watching the telepathy tapes, because I watched the telepathy tapes and I was very upset. But after this, I feel like there's something that is so valuable and important here. And I wish you all of the luck in the world and the greatest success possible. And
Thank
I'm
you.
so grateful for you taking the time. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right, bye, folks.
Bye, everybody.